Hi, everybody. This is the second poem for the week by an African American author. We have three this week. I've already talked about We Wear the Mask. This one is called Harlem by Langston Hughes. And you'll notice something familiar once I read the poem, and we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. So, the Harlem Renaissance is important to know. This is a very brief historical lesson about the Harlem Renaissance and where Langston Hughes fits in, but he was part of this movement. It was a period of time and a cultural movement from about 1915 or so to 1940, so a very short period of time. But during this era, Black American artists of all kinds moved in record numbers from places in the South to northern cities, mostly New York City, but also Chicago and Washington, D.C. Thus, it was called Harlem because of the name of the borough in New York City. These artists and writers were encouraged to celebrate their heritage, and they found in Harlem, Chicago, and DC somewhat better economic opportunities and freedom. And as a young man, Langston Hughes was a part of this group, although he wrote Harlem in 1951. He started his career during the 1920s and 30s when this movement was in full swing. So he was very young. He had done a lot in his youth. Besides going to college, he had a lot of odd jobs here and there, but he knew he wanted to be a writer. And so he joined this movement and became a part of it. Other prominent members of the Harlem Renaissance were Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote an important novel called Their Eyes Were Watching God, Louis Armstrong, the jazz artist, Countee Cullen, and Claude McKay, who were also both poets. So the title of the poem is Harlem, written and published in 1951. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So here we have a poem with only 11 lines and 7 sentences. The sentences, as you can see, are mostly questions. There is one statement which takes up all of stanza 3. So this is a 4-stanza poem. You notice that there's space in between all 4 stanzas, meaning that the first line of the poem and the last line of the poem are actually their own stanza. So we would call this a 4-stanza poem with 11 lines and 7 sentences. When we first read the poem, we have to understand the meaning of the word defer. What happens to a dream deferred? The definition of defer means to put off or delay or postpone for another time. So that is obviously important. This is also a poem about the African American community as seen by the title. Now, even if you did not know that Langston Hughes was an African American man, you could read the title Harlem in 1951. Understand that it's one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. There are Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Harlem. And at the time, and up until quite recently, it was predominantly a Black community. Harlem was almost 100% Black. And that's where a lot of the members of the Harlem Renaissance actually congregated. They went to the Cotton Club, which was a famous jazz club where Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, a little past her time, but Josephine Baker, the jazz singer, I meant a little before her time for Fitzgerald, but um, all of these happenings in Harlem give us an idea of the setting and therefore why it's about Black Americans predominantly. And the poem wonders ultimately through imagery and questioning what happens when dreams of Black Americans are delayed or postponed. So here are the possibilities of what can happen. And the speaker is, I imagine, Langston Hughes. He's asking these questions. he does not come into the poem. He's asking them like an objective observer. So it's nothing like Maya Angelou saying, "Still I rise." It's nothing like We Wear the Mask, where Paul Laurence Dunbar has put himself in a group of other um, African Americans. Here, it's almost as if Hughes is the objective observer asking what happens to these dreams in the community. Um, Three of the images are about food, and we see those in the first question, the third question, and the fourth question: raisin, rotten meat, and syrupy sweet. And think about what that might mean. In my mind, food is something that sustains us, it's sustenance. It's something that helps us survive, it keeps us alive. We need food to survive. I think of these images as related to survival, but in kind of an ironic way. What happens when the dream of an African American or the dream of an entire race cannot be completed? When it's postponed, when it's delayed indefinitely, the survival is stalled. So dreams stalled, therefore, equals the very being of a human stalled, their very essence and what and who they are. Does the dream dry up? Does it fester? Does it stink? Does it crust and sugar over? These questions he asks make us think of these images. So think carefully about these images and what all of these things mean. It is a rhymed poem, though not a wholly regularly rhymed poem. Nothing like Still I Rise, or We Wear the Mask, or Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, or Richard Cory. All of those are very regularly rhymed. This one has a number of lines at the end that do rhyme, which gives it a very memorable quality. And most of the lines are very short. In fact, the longest line is the first one: what happens to a dream deferred? Um, but we can see that sun rhymes with run, and meat rhymes with sweet, and load rhymes with explode. So it's not necessarily every other line that rhymes, but there's enough in there to call it a rhyming poem. I think of the word sags with an excellent connotation when we get to that line that he states rather than asks. He doesn't know what happens. He uses the word maybe, but the word sag, like a heavy load, gives us that quality of how much of a burden it is. If something sags, it's almost hitting the ground. It's not upright. It's not bold. It's not making a statement. It's almost dead, essentially, something that sags. And the last line, I want to go over the last line a little bit. It's not only a question, but it's in italics. And so that's another piece of punctuation in terms of the craft that we want to cover and consider, because obviously the italics are meaningful and it makes us pause for a longer period of time and emphasizes the line. Now, in my mind, explode could mean different things. Explode out, like blowing up, something exploding. And therefore the dream is gone. If you defer it, it's gone. It eventually explodes. Or explode into, almost like a building that's being demolished. Exploding out might relate to the notion of protest that is to come in the Black community that was already starting. It's either exploding out, like I said just a minute ago, and dissipating and disappearing, or the entire movement is exploding out in order to be heard. Certainly starting in the 1950s, as we see with A Raisin in the Sun, the Lorraine Hansberry play we read earlier in the semester, the Black community had already started to protest their place. Some of this was historical. For instance, Black Americans fought alongside white Americans in World War II, but when they came home, they were still subject to Jim Crow laws, and they were still subject to discrimination. And so a poem like this, and then 8 years later, a play like Lorraine Hansberry's that takes its title from A Raisin in the Sun line in this poem, suggests that protest against cultural oppression was happening at this point. I think exploding in So, kind of an exploding inward might relate to the notion that Black Americans were not free individually to pursue their dreams. And so the dreams sort of explode in on themselves and demolish. So you can think of explode in lots of different ways. That's just the way I like to read it. And certainly there are other things to consider in this poem that I didn't go over in a lot of detail, things that if you choose to explicate this poem for your paper, you can really get into. The sound qualities, the imagery of the smell and um, the texture and the feel and what things look like and how they even taste, and even more on the food imagery, what he means with the questions. So, all of these are possibilities as you continue to read and think about this short, little, but very seminal and important four stanza poem. Okay, that's all we have. Bye bye.